All right, so before we get into the meat, let's do a quick little review on the book of Esther. Who can tell me what Esther's Jewish name was? No one? Okay.
Dash.
Her name was Hadassah. Hadassah, which means myrtle. And if you looked at the first image that we have here, this beautiful tree is a myrtle tree. And the thought process was behind her, or what the scholars have said is that, her name is myrtle or mystery. And when we see the word Ishtar, that's where we see either star or Ishtar, that goddess of love from the Persians. Potentially fertile myrtle. We saw the time period. So we see that world history 539 BC to 331 BC, Ahasuerus ruled from 486 to 465. So Esther covers the period of 483 to 473. We talked about the word providence. Who can tell me what providence means? Anyone? So if something is happening providentially, it means that God is at work without our understanding. So what we've read thus far in the book shows us that God is providentially setting the stage for Esther, for Mordecai, and for the Jews. Okay? We talked about the kingdom of Ahasuerus. This is where we have this huge kingdom. And the way that this book started out with was with a party. Does anyone remember how long the party was?
80 days.
Mike said 180 days.
Mike is correct. It was a 180-day party that ended with a 7-day party. But at the end of that 7-day party, does anyone remember what happened to the wife of the king, Queen Vashti? What happened?
She got dethroned.
She got dethroned because she wouldn't listen to her husband. And so they made a point of it because they were concerned if the queen doesn't listen to the king, then none of the women will listen to the men. So they made a point to go ahead and send her away. And
good point made.
Yeah, I know, right? Shh. So after that, there was a 4-year period, which is when the king is out trying to take over the Greeks. He loses miserably, comes back, missing his wife, and his advisors tell him to do what? Have a big what? Big beauty pageant, where he called all the pretty women.
Oh, that's right.
All the pretty women and had them. How long was their spa day? How long did it last?
A year.
It was a 12-month. It was a 12-month spa year.
Women won't forget that.
Yeah, they won't.
No.
So, Mom, ours starts on the 15th of September and goes on.
That's right. It needs to last a whole full 12 months.
Okay. Yeah. You guys remember what happened to not listening to the husband, right? I just want to make sure we're on a level playing field right now.
There you go.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay. Next slide. So
Next slide.
Next slide. We see Queen Esther gets chosen. She's just more beautiful than everyone else. And you could tell she's got a good heart. When there was a request made, they could bring anything with them when they went in before the king. She didn't want to bring anything and just asked the guard, what he thought the best interest would be. You could tell that she handled things very well. So the king chooses her. And then during this time period, Mordecai, who remembers who Mordecai was? Who was Mordecai?
That was her uncle.
Yes.
That's
right.
his uncle.
And why was Mordecai taking care of Esther?
Because her parents were dead.
Yes, her parents were dead. They weren't used on this. Okay. So Mordecai was obviously, he loved Esther like it was his daughter, like she was his daughter, I should say, not it. and he would frequently sit at the king's gate to hear what was going on with, the beauty pageant and hear the things of the queen. And coincidentally, while he was sitting there, what did he get it? What did he hear? What did he accidentally spy into?
That somebody was gonna overtake.
Yes. So two of the high-ranking officials were planning on killing the king, and it was a coup. And so Mordecai delivered that message to the appropriate channel through Esther to the king, and the king records it. A formal investigation is launched in it, and they find out that these men were planning to kill, and they hang them. Also during that time, the king promotes a man by the name of Haman. Who can remember who Haman was?
He's a bad dude.
He's a bad dude, yes. Yes. So Michelle's right. It's just, I don't know if you guys can hear her. Good job, Lawson. He hit the side of his head, though. So Haman was an Agagite, right? Agagite. And he could have been a direct descendant of King Agag, which was who God told King Saul to wipe out. We know that King Saul, his direct descendant would have been Mordecai. They came from these lineages, so we saw something pretty cool about that. But as Haman gets promoted, he likes it when everyone pays homage to him, but the Jews don't pay homage. They don't bow to a man. They only bow to God. And so this guy was super upset about it. It really just rubbed him the wrong way. And so we talked about that a little bit. So what Haman does is he devises a plan. Does anyone remember what the plan was?
Yeah, kill all the Jews.
Right. And why did the king sign off on it? Do you know?
I forgot.
The king signed off on it because Haman said that he would pay 10,000 talents of silver to the treasuries. So if you just came out of a 4-year battle with the Greeks and you've lost, there's no spoil to bring home from war. Hearing about an insubordinate group of people who then you're going to absolve all of their wealth and all of their money to put it back in the treasury seems like a pretty good idea. If you're a secular person, right? So he gets the signet ring from the king, and he puts forth this message to every province that King Ahasuerus oversaw. What does Mordecai do?
Where's
Yes, keep
cloth,
going.
whatever it is.
Yes, sackcloth and
Sackcloth
ashes.
and, yeah.
And his niece sees that he's out in the courtyard in sackcloth and ashes. And what does she do?
Offering clothes.
She offers him clothes. But essentially at that point, she finds out that Haman has sent out this message. And there's a very unique statement that comes out of this. And I noticed a lot of pastors use this particular phrase out of this scripture where it says such a time as this. And so we see here, and this is right about where we left off. I have a slide exactly where we stepped off. So we see here that Esther was concerned to go before the king, because if anyone went before the king and the king didn't permit them to come or didn't have a prearranged meeting with them, they would be killed. And so she had to step out. And she decides at this time that what difference does it make? If I don't go to the king, then Haman's going to have us all killed. If I do go to the king and he kills us, then I was going to die anyways. So, there was some thought behind it, but what's really interesting is the words that came out of Mordecai, because we see here, it says, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. And then she's also going to fast likewise. So it's very interesting here that, number one, Mordecai he knows that God will preserve the Jews because God is faithful and he is just, and he has said through the Abrahamic covenant, and actually at this point also through the Davidic covenant, that the Jews will have a place. And so Mordecai is not worried about the total annihilation of the Jews. But he's saying, what if God has you in this specific position for this day, for such a time as this? And so this is about where we left off. I know we actually left off at the end of chapter 5, but I'm going to read from 5 through because we will get through it in no time. So we're now at the point where Esther makes a request, beginning in chapter 5, verses 1 through 8. Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing out in the court, that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, queen? What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of my king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." So, Esther's not asking for riches, for fame, for any of these other things. She's not asking for half the kingdom. Oh, yeah, I'll take half the kingdom. She's asking for the king to come to another meal, right? And for Haman to be there. So imagine if you're Haman, you just got to sit with the queen and the king, very private type of environment, very intimate environment, and you're going to go home. So Haman went out joyful that day and glad in his heart. So he's leaving the king's court. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and let in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So, Haman, he's sick, and he's got some pretty bad friends, and his wife's not so awesome either. And 50 cubits is 75 feet tall. So he's really making a statement by having that. What do you need? And so instead of going home joyous that he's second in command to the king, that he's been invited to this dinner and that all this other stuff, he's furious that Mordecai didn't bow or isn't concerned about the fact that he's put out this decree to wipe out all the Jews. And so he's frustrated. So this is, remember this, because this is going to happen in rapid fire. Queen Esther made the petition for them to come to a wine banquet. Haman, the king Ahasuerus, and Esther sit down for wine, and Esther invites them to another party for the following day. Haman goes home that night, has these guys build these gallows, and he's going to wake up first thing in the morning, go to the king. So that night, this is the night that Haman went home and was having that work done. That night, the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and then they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" So this is that night. It's now gone into morning. The king couldn't sleep, so the best way to do it is to have someone read to him. And he's reading the Chronicles of the King, and it just so happens that the page that they open to is about Mordecai developing or essentially sharing about this plot to have him killed. So the king asks, who's in the court? And who does he see? Lo and behold, is Haman. Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man who the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let his robe and the horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback throughout the city square and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man in whom the king delights to honor.'" Because Haman's thinking this is about him. And then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken." Does anyone remember why Haman was in the king's gate?
Making the yellow.
He was suggesting to kill Mordecai that morning. He wanted to hang him on it.
Yeah.
And now he's going to be parading him around the city because he's the highest prince, right? So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback throughout the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, the form you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So Haman had just got done parading around Mordecai throughout the entire city square, right? He got home to tell him how embarrassed he was. And his wife and his friends are basically like, "Dude, you're done for if he really is a Jew." So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we have been sold, me, my people, and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a wicked thing, or to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman, the Agagite, and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, that the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see evil that will come up to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with one of the king's signet rings. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, to the 23rd day. And it was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses bred from swift steeds. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So, as you guys remember, whenever something is done by the Persians, you cannot just revoke the law. You have to write something else. So in this instance, what Mordecai diligently writes, which it must have been done by the Holy Spirit, was that the Jews get to defend themselves. And so what we see is all the Jews in all these provinces gathering together, building small little militant outfits so that they can essentially protect themselves. So even though the decree from Mordecai went out that it was permissible, the decree went out from Haman that it was permissible to kill these Jews, there's a new decree that all the Jews are allowed to band together and kill them, whoever defend themselves, so to speak. So a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, so that the Jews would be ready on the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So, do you guys remember we talked about that word, a proselyte? That is someone who reforms themselves to become a Jew. They try and petition to become a Jew. They learn the religion. They do all the things to become of Jewish, to become Jewish religiously, so to speak, not nationally. So people are converting to Judaism. They're switching over. They're leaving their idols because they saw how powerful the Jews had become and how respected. And so they wanted to be like the Jews. It's just quite different from what Haman's intent was, right? So now we see, now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmishtha, Arisia, Aridia, and Vajeshva, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your further request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, according to today's decree. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons, and the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives, had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. This day is called Purim. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which has turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast cast lots, to consume them and destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that his sons should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants, and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these. Sorry, I was watching the baby. To confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters for their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of the Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace to all his countrymen. And that is the end of Esther. I do think it's kind of cool, and I don't know if you know this, Miguel, this might be something cool for you, is that King Ahasuerus, the other name they have for him is King Xerxes. What do you think his son's name is?
King Xerxes.
What do you think King Xerxes' son's name was?
I have no idea. Oh, Ahasuerus.
King Artaxerxes Longimanus. Do you remember what was special about King Artaxerxes Longimanus?
No.
You will. He gave the decree to go and rebuild the temple and the wall to the Jews, which was 173,880 days, just as described by the book of Daniel. Do you remember that whole thing?
Yes, when they started rebuilding and then sent people back.
Yes. Yeah.
They did it on three times, right?
Yes. But that was the specific one where I believe it was Nehemiah.
Yeah, because they rebuilt the wall, the temple, and then they brought a whole bunch of people back.
Right. But
Yes.
it's interesting for me to see that, because you can infer from the text, or what's missing in the text, that Queen Esther and Mordecai must have had an impact on Artaxerxes Longimanus, the son of King Ahasuerus, which was
Okay.
probably the son from his wife Vashti the first time. But we don't know that. It's just very interesting to note that. We see historically how these things are happening in sequence. And if you look at it pretty closely, you can see that this is, I mean, the Bible is, we talk about this all the time, that it's written outside of our time domain. So it speaks of things that are happening in the future before they happen.
And how perfectly everything fits together.
It's super cool. So the Feast of Purim is something that's still celebrated today. If you ever wondered what it was on your calendar, now you know that it's a remembrance of when the Jews essentially had the ability to defend. I'm just watching Lawson attack Lily. Sorry, guys. It just it had the ability for them to defend themselves, and they celebrate it like we would celebrate Christmas. So, is there any questions about Esther? It's a great story, isn't it?
Yes.
It's like a rag to riches Cinderella type story. There's just great drama that that the Jews are all going to be annihilated, and you can see Satan working in the backdrop, but God providentially worked through the whole thing. The fact that the very night before Haman goes in to request to have Mordecai hung, the king reads from the Chronicles that Mordecai had done this great deed for him and saved his life. And then when Haman comes in, oh, what would I do for someone that the king delights in gosh, I can't even think of the word.
He was doing it for the person that he hated the most in the world.
That's right. That's right. But Haman was so convinced that it was himself. But that's what we mean by providence, you know, is that God's plan is ultimately working throughout all this. So though we didn't read anything specifically that said anything about God, you could see that his hand was in it the entire time. So we are finished way early.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
What happened to that, what do you call it, about the queen? I forgot what he mentioned, when they got together and said, no, you gotta get another queen because then they're not gonna listen to their husbands.
Yes.
What's the name of that thing? What they send out? The decree. What happened to that decree?
Are you
About-
asking if it's still in play today?
Yeah, I mean, what in the world happened?
Well,
Anyway,
we knew that she.
Diaper, Miguel.
what was that?
Man, hold on, let me turn this recording off. Blows are gonna start going here. Michelle's getting fighting words.